just either a slightly different from what they are, or we talk, we see things that are normal.
Welcome to Strange Familiars. Tonight we're going to be talking with Joshua Cutchin about his most recent book, Thieves in the Night. But before we get to that, if you have a story of something strange you encountered, something paranormal, or any kind of story you think we should cover, please get in touch. strangefamiliarspodcast@gmail.com or strangefamiliars.com. You can always find us there. Strange Familiars is brought to you by our patrons. If you'd like to be a patron, if you'd like to help us make the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/strangefamiliars. There's lots of different options there, different levels of support, and you can get things like t-shirts, patches, and more. But even $3 a month, you get full extra episodes of Strange Familiars. So if you'd like to help us out, if you'd like to support the show, check it out. patreon.com/strangefamiliars. I also wanted to remind everybody that my newest book is out now. It's available on Amazon.com and at your local bookstore. It's called Don't Look Behind You. You can find it by typing in the title or by typing in my name, Timothy Renner, at Amazon. I cover a lot of the things we talk about here on Strange Familiars, some of my own experiences and more, and it's got a lot of my artwork and some of my best illustrations I think I've done. That's Don't Look Behind You. Again, it's at Amazon or wherever you buy books. The reaction to the Broken Circle series was wonderful. It seemed everyone really liked it. They were definitely fun for me to put together. It was a lot of production work, and it was hard to get the audio even and so forth. When we do shows like that, we're using multiple different recording methods. But I did my best, and everybody seemed to like it, and I'm excited about that. And we'll be doing more like that in the future. Maybe not necessarily true crime, but some more kind of produced episodes like that. They take a long time to put together, so we can't do them all the time. But we have more like that coming up. I'm glad everybody liked it, and like we said, hopefully we'll have more information on Jenny Beam and a follow-up to the Broken Circle in the future. So let's get to our conversation with Joshua Cutchin. Done writing questions. Like, I used to write out questions. First of all, half the time I'd never read them anyway. And then the other half of the time, whoever I'm talking to has either answered all the questions on their own before I ever got to them, or said much more interesting things that led down different paths anyway. So
that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah. And before we get done, remind me, I'm going to have you choose 2 random numbers, and they will be for the book giveaway. So.
Oh, geez. Okay, cool.
But we'll do that a little bit later. Let me get a drink and then we'll get started. Joshua Cutchin, my future co-author.
Welcome, partner in crime.
Yeah, welcome to Strange Familiars. We'll talk a little bit about that. Of course, we don't want to give too much away because it's so far down the road. The end is nowhere near in sight.
Yeah, it's only just beginning.
Yeah.
Actually, there's... there are some things I think I'm sort of rounding the corner on in terms of getting some of my stuff squared away, but I still have a lot of stuff to look into. I just ordered Rob Briggs's books and finally getting around to digging into George Hansen, The Trickster and the Paranormal. And then actually tomorrow morning I'm waking up bright and early and I'm getting out to the library at UGA to sort of dig into some stuff that's out there that, those books that you don't want to buy because there's like one thing in them that you think might have something in it.
Right.
So, yeah, so that's where I'm off to tomorrow morning. first thing.
That's a good question. And I wonder this myself because I have a malleable schedule. Now, the podcast has somewhat firmed that schedule up a little bit. But, for instance, I don't have a specific thing. Like, when I wake up, I will work on something. Write a book, or I will, write on a book, write something I'm working on. I'll work on the podcast, or I'll do some research. But it's not like I have a scheduled time. Like between, 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. I research, and 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. I write, or whatever. Do you have a set schedule like that when you're doing writing?
I mean, of course I don't, because we're people with non-structured lifestyles are brought towards this sort of thing, It's more about the times that I have that are things. But, my schedule is not conventional as it is. I mean, I pick up gigs here and there, and even my standard visiting schools to teach gigs, they fluctuate from week to week because of school schedules and because of, I was supposed to have a student that I saw for a lesson tonight. He had to cancel for, various reasons. So I'm never really ever doing the same thing all the time. So I carry a couple of books that I need to look through in my car. And my biggest problem is that I don't know how to stop working in a lot of ways. So if I'm not doing something music related, I'm almost always doing something that's, pushing my next book project forward, so I'm looking up stuff online. Even when I'm supposed to be relaxing, I'll be playing a video game with my podcast on, listening for something. I mean, there's so many little leads here and there that just come from mainstreaming 8 or 9 different paranormal podcasts every week.
Right.
And it's not even like something is mentioned, like a case is mentioned. It's just someone will say something, and then you sort of draw this A to B to C sort of diagram that says, oh my gosh, I can't believe I never thought of that,
Oh, yeah. That's the big thing, connecting A to B and B to C. I guess that's one of the biggest kinships I've felt with you, that I think is something we both really enjoy doing. It's like, oh, wait, now here's this. Now this is, what about this?
Yeah, that, and I was thinking about this today because I'm literally like, I feels a little bit like Christmas tonight. Go into the library tomorrow. I'm really excited I've got a list of about 25 different books that I need to look up, and I'm going to go there and I'm going to, get all the information that I need. And from what I gather of your method, that's sort of, I can imagine you going into, I imagine that you approach the libraries and research in the same way. I always feel like Gandalf, dusting off, dusting off something in the Minas Tirith library.
I love research. I have a good friend who is way more part of academia than I will ever be, who has suggested, why don't you, do research professionally for people? I'm like, well, I would maybe if the paycheck was there, but I certainly love doing it myself. I could just, and I never stop. That's the other thing, that I'm getting ready to publish the second book on Toad Road. I never thought I'd get 2 books out of that. But I keep researching. I keep finding stuff, and really cool stuff. I'm like, all right, that should have gone in the first book, and then suddenly added enough for a second book.
Yeah, well, the problem with doing research professionally is that if you're in that sort of a gig economy, you end up researching the cost of shoes in Victorian in Victorian brothels or something, and that's something just absolutely inane. But I think that this new book of yours is going to be pretty darn special. I like it better than Beyond the Seventh Gate myself.
Oh, thank you. I think there's more of me in it, so I was able to write more of me in it, if that makes sense. It was more than just stating, this happened here and that happened there. There's more of me in there. So.
Well, if somebody really wanted to do a Kraken reality show, they'd send you to a portal area type place for a season. That's the reality show. That's the next big, the next big thing is they send you to, Marley Woods, or, I mean, maybe not Skinwalker, but they send you to, some sort of obscure place. And you just, I eat that stuff up, and I don't think, here we are, massaging each other's egos, but I really don't think anybody quite does it with the diligence that you do.
Oh,
so that's all for that.
Thank you so much. So the book that we're talking about, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. Way back when you were beginning this, I had you on to talk about Changelings, and I think you had just started the book then, and I almost felt a little bad, are we giving away too much? But no, the book is thick with a lot of information in there.
Yeah, they just keep on getting bigger, and I feel bad about it. Eventually, one of these days, and it might be our project, honestly, something's going to need to be split in two, a volume 1 and a volume 2.
Yeah. There's a lot of information.
Yeah, we've bitten off a lot more than we can chew for this next project, folks, I think, sometimes. But anyway, that aside, I really sort of went, I had this real bugaboo about making sure that we get as much stuff into the book as we can, be as thorough as we can.
Yeah.
And I've slowly had to back off from that. But even now, after the fact, even though it's, a 400-something page book, including, that includes like 150 pages of references, endnotes, and index. But even, setting that aside, I still see books that might have just a slight variation on one of the stories, and I get upset that I wasn't able to include it. So that's the hardest part for me.
We've talked about that before. It's inevitably, whenever you publish a book, you'll find something afterwards. Even with the historical Wildman books, I find articles, that could have gone in the Pennsylvania book or could have gone in the California book all the time. So I'm going to, whenever I'm done the whole rest of the country, I'll have to do this addendum book with all the stuff I found that could have gone in the original books. I think we're both completists, which is the danger about working together. I think that's the hard...
That and the other thing that really... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just it's going to be difficult for either one of us to convince the other one that doesn't need to go in there because we're both completists. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. It's a completist idea, and I think you've got to go into things like this with the attitude that it's not going to be released. It's got to escape, and at some point somebody's just got to push it out of the nest.
Right. Yeah, and that has to happen with all things. I mean, that's I've worked with some very creative people who can never give up. They can never let it go. And
right.
At some point you have to say it's done.
Well, being a musician, we've all met that guy who's like working on his first album, and it's like 12 years.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was specifically talking about a musician actually when I said that.
Nice. That's the other thing, is that it gets to be frustrating. I understand why it happens, so it's nobody's fault. But you release the book, and then all the great stories from people come in.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
You can talk about you're writing it as much as you want to, and you'll get a little trickle here and there. But as soon as you write the book, everybody's like, I have a story that shouldn't be in your book. And it's like, that's great. I guess I'll put it, on the shelf for the revised version. And honestly, I do think there's some revised versions of some of my books coming up in the future, especially a Trojan Feast. I think there's a lot more that I could have said about that, because I was sort of finding my legs. But
right.
Yeah, sometimes you just gotta say stop and just let it go.
Yeah. So this is sort of a very mundane question, but at what point did you think the book on supernatural child abduction has to be written?
No, that's a good question, because it's not. I mean, it's not a subject that you really. Once you start looking into it, it's not a subject that you want to spend time with. It takes you to a lot of really unsettling places. My main impetus for this was that I wrote a good deal about fairy folklore in A Trojan Feast, which for some reason has really resonated with me, that aspect of the unexplained. And I didn't really write more than a couple of paragraphs, really, in The Brimstone Deceit about fairies. And I'm like, I would really love to get back into that, because if you can do research that doesn't feel like research, that's half the battle. And that's definitely one of those situations. So I looked into that, and I thought, well, that's a good reason to do it. And then, part of it was me trying to square up another aspect of alien lore with fairy lore, and vice versa. Specifically the alien hybrid concept, the idea that human beings are having their DNA combined with extraterrestrials. I wanted to see if there was a way that I could find some sort of analog for that in fairy lore, because I believe strongly, especially after completing this book, that you will always find an analog for one and the other, even if they aren't the exact same thing. I tend to think that they are, but you'll always find an analog for one for the other. So it was really me trying to be intellectually honest about that. And then lastly, once I started going down those two routes, the real clincher was the fact that there isn't a one-stop shop for changeling lore anymore. The book that I've referenced a couple of times in some other shows is from, I believe, the 1930s. It's only in German, and there are only a handful of copies still available. It's called Der Wechselbalg. And so obviously there isn't really, your sort of one-stop shop for finding out changeling lore, and especially in English, but especially in print, and especially, readily available. Those were a lot of the different reasons why I sort of ended up looking in this direction. And I generally have not been a person who has been, because if you run around and especially evangelical circles, they'll say that there are certain things that you don't need to put into your mind. Certain media that you shouldn't watch because it can actually open you up to things. But after spending some time with this stuff, I kind of wonder if that's not the case. Taking a look at these things, because it is such a dark place. And even if there isn't something metaphysical going on there, you can't unread some things. That's for sure. You can only look into, stories of people gold plating human fetuses for magical occult practice in Thailand and go to sleep easily. It just doesn't happen.
Right. And we're talking about, for the large part, missing children, kidnapped, presumably, for whatever reason. So it goes to a dark place. But I really like the conclusion you make at the end, where you talk about basically this is part of re-enchanting the world, and you phrased it much better than I did. But to paraphrase it, you kind of said, even if fairies aren't real, they provide a sort of magical way of looking at trees or so forth, of interacting with nature, say. My own, what I've been saying lately, and I've come to it like this. So I used to say, well, isn't it neat that these fae stories and this folklore from the past sure sounds a lot like things we're talking about today. And I've moved to that even further, where I say, and I'll quote myself, and I said, maybe what we were calling fairy tales are really just tales of the fairies, and maybe those were cryptid reports that, they get changed over time. It's a little bit of whispering down the lane, but also we're looking at things through a different cultural lens now, because there's so much in common. We could spend, I don't know how many episodes, just drawing equivalencies between changeling stuff and alien abductions and Sasquatch stuff and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is a great deal of what you do in the book in a readable way. But, that's where I'm living lately. You know what I mean? I don't know that it's nothing I have to win you over to, certainly.
Right.
But
well, I personally believe that one of the most retarding things to this particular venture of studying the unknown has been the manner in which we have siloed ourselves off into these different sort of discrete camps. I think that it's really stymied growth. I mean, you have some people who want to take one of those things, one of those silos. And honestly, I'm guilty of this to some degree. But people who want to take one of those silos, I think the ufologists are the most guilty of this, and blanket that with everything. So Bigfoot is an alien. Time slips are because of aliens. Anything anomalous is because of extraterrestrials. Similarly, you have some of the more evangelical circles, Christianized circles, that are saying that everything is demons. And I think that what they fail to see is that the failure in that perception is that any one of those concepts is right on its own. We have 5 silos, and one of them is correct, and all the other ones have got to nest into it, when they're not really seeing that they're all separate things inside one silo, one larger silo. In other words, the 5 Russian dolls are not going to nest inside themselves. They're nesting, and they're just in one giant nesting Russian doll.
Right, yeah.
And I think that people probably get me a little bit wrong when I talk about fairies all the time, because fairy lore is extremely resonant, and we've talked about this some, I believe, but there's a problem because fairy used to be kicked around the same way that we kick around the term supernatural. So a lot of people would say, oh, that's of fairy, or that's fairy, and so it looks like it's all fairy lore, but that just means that's just their way of using the term for supernatural. But having said that, I think fairy lore is really explicative, but I don't think that the fairy lore is completely accurately describing these phenomena. It's a way of understanding these phenomena, but I don't think that a lot of the codified, structured, rigid ideas of fairyland being underground and, I don't think any. I think it's an attempt to explain something, and I think that I almost treat it as a means of linking different disciplines that are themselves within something else. I don't know what fairy lore is describing. I don't know what the extraterrestrial, particularly the direct contact experience is describing. Not even really sure now, after diving into this book, what these Bigfoot encounters are describing. But I'm sure that they're at least describing aspects of the same thing, if not the very same thing. Yeah. And one of those threads that really runs through all these things. Honestly, I didn't think it would run through the Bigfoot thing as much as it has, but it's pretty surprising. Is fairy lore. Mm-hmm. And it's really, really, really interesting to me how that sort of almost the connectivity and the resonance and the durability, I guess is probably a good way of putting it. The durability of that body of belief is never ending in terms of how it keeps on unfolding and revealing new things to me.
Oh yeah. Do you think, for instance, and I'm trying to think of the way to phrase this, which isn't completely bonkers, but let's say
we're among friends. It's okay.
So it's an old fairy report, say, they're talking about, an elf or something like this, some sort of weird creature that they see. Let's, it's a little red cap or something. Do you think they were seeing the exact same thing that people are seeing now when they see a gray alien, for instance? Or do you think they literally were seeing something different? Like, I mean, culturally, these things seem to change. There's enough between them, but it seems like things grow and change, like, with the culture, which is really, really interesting.
I think that a lot of the people that I think a lot of we're all sort of triangulating in on the same thing. And I know it's folly to think that we're getting towards an answer, but there are some times when I really wonder if we are. I think there's a lot of strength in the model that Greg Bishop is talking about now, with the idea of co-creation, the idea that there is something objective, but we are bringing a lot of our own baggage to it. Mm-hmm. It's not – the idea has a lot of antecedents, but Greg is really trying to sort of take it even further with ideas pertaining to information theory and other things like that. I think you have to say that there is a user-generated component to this. I mean, that has to be the case, because there are similarities, certainly, between the fairies of yesterday and the gray aliens of today, let's say. There are similarities between the Gilly-Doo or the Woodwose or the Green Man and Sasquatch, but they're not a one-to-one match in all cases. Some cases you'll find they are a one-to-one match.
Right.
At the same time, you have sightings today, fairy sightings today, that are unambiguously of little people. That seem very much of a different flavor than those gray alien interactions. So, I think that they're probably the same thing is there, but the same thing is not seen, if that makes any sense.
Okay, yeah.
For whatever reasons, individual bias, the way that the phenomena wishes to be seen, perhaps some features of the land or something along those lines. I mean, it's interesting. I feel like one of the best models out there for really explaining these things is really, Neil Gaiman's American Gods, which is, this idea that people bring their belief systems and their gods with them, and they tend to inhabit parts of the landscape. I mean, that's the reason that, there are certain fairy traditions that were imported into the eastern coast of Canada and the Northeast as well. It's the reason why, you might have stories of pixies in Wales amongst a mining community that was mostly settled by the Cornish. You don't have pixies in Wales. Pixies are Cornish. But in terms of the people, they brought those beliefs with them, and because they brought those beliefs with them, that was what was perceived. That's what was seen.
Right.
And I know it's kind of silly to say fiction might be closest to reality, but sometimes, especially if we're if we're in this sort of imaginal realm, perhaps that really is sort of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think, when we get into this area of folklore too, a lot of people, and this is a big, drumbeat of mine, a lot of people equate folklore to fiction. Yes and no. I mean, yeah, there is a fictional element to folklore, especially as time goes on and it gets further away, I think, probably from the original story, or other stories get folded into it. And I mean, this is the folk process. This happens. It's a big game of whispering down the lane. Like I said, it just goes on and on. People add to it. People subtract from it. That's the folk process. But, I think there's these fictional elements that are also very real ways of transmitting ideas, which are practical ways to communicate people's experiences with the other, and sometimes even how to deal with the other.
Right, and I think that instead of looking at the object, we should really be looking at the effect on the witness. And I know this is something that gets kicked around a lot, but I mean, if you look at the motifs and you look at the emotions that are inspired, they are extremely consistent. You can treat these things as being, reskinned versions of these older mythologies.
Right.
And but sometimes you have to sort of squint and look sideways at some of these motifs and how they're expressed. I think something that gets lost a lot is the fact that a direct inversion of a motif can be an expression of the same motif. So one of the things I talk about in the book is how, in the Changeling stories, beings from the other world would take a sick child of the other world, leave it in the human world, and take the desirable, healthy human child to the other world. So that doesn't quite map on to what you see in modern hybrid stories. There are similarities between the way that alien hybrids look and the way that changelings looked, and I go into some of those motifs. But what you've also got to look at is like the indigo children idea or the star children idea is a clever inversion of that. So you have these beings of the other world taking a more desirable child from the other world and leaving it in the human world. Similarly, there are some ideas that twins one of whom might die in the womb. This is actually a pretty new age concept, but the idea that if there's a twin that dies in the womb, well, that's the perfect child, and it's living amongst the extraterrestrials, while the less perfect human child is the one that survived. And again, this idea of the dead living amongst extraterrestrials really does resonate with that idea of fairies and the dead and the way that they would often commingle. Similarly, finally, in a lot of these sort of star child scenarios, it's often said that the child may feel as if their human parents are not their true parents. And again, that's another sort of inversion of the changeling motif. It's the humans not belonging to the child, but also the adults rather than the children being the ones who have been, sort of supplanted. So you have to sort of look at these things, I think. It sort of reminds me of music. A sixth or a third are both consonants, and they're different intervals, but they're kind of the same interval too. If you have an F against a D or a D against an F, it still has the same sort of consonant sound. I'm sorry, anybody who doesn't understand that metaphor, but it's kind of the way I feel about it.
We should have a keyboard so we can demonstrate while we're
right.
Absolutely. Well, let's step back, and for those who didn't listen to the Changeling show, and shame on you if you didn't, because I don't know how many episodes ago that was. The Changeling sort of trope has been, there's no beginning to it and no end. It goes right hand in hand with humanity, as long as we've been keeping records and so forth. And it's basically the fear or the I guess it's the reality, if it happens to you, of something and coming and taking your child and often replacing it with something that may or may not look like your child, but that is not your child. And this was blamed on fairies. This was blamed on all manner of supernatural creatures, depending on the culture. It was a very real fear for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would argue that it's, in some sense, a very real fear today. Once you start seeing this motif, it crops up everywhere. You can look at the first season of Stranger Things, where, spoiler alert, I don't know if have you seen it? Am I going to spoil it for you?
No, I've seen it.
Okay. So spoiler alert, hide your ears if you haven't seen it. But they find a fake body of Will Byers. And that has some of the fingerprints of the changeling phenomena, in the terms of the dead and lifeless stock. Similarly, I would argue that the entire second season is almost a changeling story in and of itself. He's come back from the other world and he's not himself. There's something inside of him. But it was, right, it was a very real fear, and the fact that it was as culturally widespread as it was, I think, warrants should give us pause. You look at, there's similar beliefs in Africa, obviously all throughout Europe, some parts of Asia, One of the things that I always find really interesting is, the fact that you can basically almost do a one-to-one mapping of the jinn onto fairies as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's interesting. In the British Isles specifically, there is little evidence for the changeling motif prior to Christianity. So there's a lot of like, I wouldn't say Christian baggage, but there's a lot of almost Abrahamic baggage that sort of talks about this idea of substituted children and about children who are not of their parents, who are not of sometimes, the body of God or whatever. But I mean, it's such a pervasive theme, and even even again, looking at pop culture, you can look at any story about a killer child as almost being sort of a changeling motif itself. To say nothing of the fact that there are some very serious and very sobering medical conditions, especially developmental disorders, that seem to be explicatory of, I would argue, a majority, not all, but a majority of these cases. Or, maybe all of these cases, and it's that both and sort of thing.
Right, yeah. Is it third rail to say autism in regards to this, or?
Yeah, I can't tell you how much anxiety I had writing the last couple of chapters of this book and sort of going down that.
Yeah, it's hard to do, because this is what I have problems writing on the missing people stuff as well, right? For modern cases especially. This is real stuff that just happened to real families, and when you start laying these kind of supernatural explanations over it, it doesn't feel like a kind thing to do. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. I mean, and to have someone who is struggling with these issues and to say, "Oh no, your child is really blessed by fairies" or something. It's just I can't imagine. I mean, I'm chuckling because it's such an uncomfortable idea. But at the same time, I think that we as paranormalists in general have to get comfortable with the idea that something can be two things at once.
Mm-hmm.
Something can have multiple explanations at once. So maybe sometimes people were actually taken by fairies, and maybe sometimes people were suffering from a developmental disorder, and maybe sometimes people were touched by the divine and had a developmental disorder. I mean, there's certainly enough cross-cultural interpretations to suggest that possibility, but it's a fine line to thread. I actually consulted with some friends of mine, a couple different friends who actually have children who have certain developmental disabilities, to say, is anything I'm saying here super, offensive? Or, is there anything that you would change? And they had very little to say in terms of that topic, which I realize that, a couple of people don't speak for an entire community.
Right.
And I'm sure if this book got national recognition, I would have my share of hate mail. But I think that there is something. I think that there's something in there. I don't know exactly how much of it is applicable, but there's something in there. There's something in that hypothesis that these people who are touched, to use that old-fashioned quaint term, might actually have some sort of spark of the divine, or actually have had some sort of contact with the divine.
It's more uncomfortable, I think, to apply it forward than backwards, and by that what I mean is say it's easier to look back at some of these changeling cases and wonder, was that just autism happening? As opposed to applying it forward to modern cases of autism and saying, is this a changeling thing? Yeah,
it at the same time, that's a central failing of the way that we interpret a lot of afflictions in medieval society. A lot of people think that if you were epileptic, they would deem you a witch, and that's not quite the proper interpretation. In some cases, yes, but in most cases, it was deemed that witches caused epilepsy.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, it wasn't believed that if you had a cleft palate that you were a fairy. It was believed that the fairy might have caused that cleft palate. In that sense, a cleft palate was something that there was actually medicine that existed to remedy that condition in a very physical way. So a lot of times we conflate cause with sort of an identifier of these people who are touched by the other. So I think that we consider our ancestors unintelligent at our peril. And I think that I mean, if you look at the literature, there really is no shortage of people who were quick to interpret changelings as this one's just a medical disorder, this one's a medical disorder, this one's a medical disorder. Oh wait, this one's different. and sometimes, now and again you do find that in the literature.
Well, I guess I'm guilty of that as well. It is easier to, what is a fault, to look back and say, oh, they didn't know what they were talking about. And again, I've talked about this in regards to my Bigfoot books, the historical ones, where, no, people knew what they were looking at. Just because it was the 1800s, it doesn't mean they were some dumb farmer who didn't know the difference between a raccoon and something that was 8 foot tall and walking on 2 legs.
Right.
I've been guilty of it myself, and I've called people out on the same thing myself.
And I think there is some of that you have to, if you're being honest, you have to look at and say, well, this is a little bit. I mean, especially with what you look at, there's so much yellow journalism and an effort to sell papers, and then you have people pushing particular religious agendas. I would argue in some cases more so than today. I think I think at least hoaxes in yesteryear, hoaxes and liars in yesteryear had a purpose. Now I think they just do it to do it, honestly.
Well, and again, this is, this is stepping into part of what's to come in our other book, but I think I'm with Ritzman on this. I think hoaxes are part of the whole thing now. They just are. It's not a pleasant part of it, and it's a part that, I think many of us wish wasn't there, but it's just there. It's part of the whole. I don't like to call it trickster, because I think that's just, and we've talked about this before. Doesn't matter if you call it
right
the jinn or fairy, or you're just putting a different name on it. But I think the trickster mask is one of the masks that we put on the other that represents its true face closer than other masks. Let's put it that way, if that makes any sense.
Well, no, it's that description. It's the same description as with fairies. You can say, well, that's like fairy lore, and that doesn't mean that it's a fairy. It just says that this is a really explicative way of talking about it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that the trickster archetype is something that is entirely appropriate in a lot of in practically all of these subjects. The where people fall short is where they assume that there is an actual trickster out there, which, I mean, in a Jungian sense, maybe. I'm not ruling that out, but I don't think that's. I honestly don't think that's what's going on. It doesn't quite sit well with me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's an aspect of it.
Yeah, I think that.
This gets in such gray area. There are features of it which have aspects of tricksterism. It's so bizarre to talk about this stuff.
Well, I mean, I think that literally the fact that hoaxes exist might be part of what feeds this phenomena. I was talking with some friends of mine the other day, and there was a suggestion, and we all shot it down for obvious reasons. But there was a suggestion that, what if we can actually coax out the phenomena by creating a hoax? Mm-hmm. In this sort of Conjuring of Philip sort of way. I mean, you're familiar with the Conjuring of Philip, right?
Not off the top of my head.
Oh, okay, great. So there was a group, and I'm probably going to get some details wrong here and there, so forgive me, anyone who's listening. But there was a group of psychical researchers who said, let's try to fashion a ghost from whole cloth. And through a series of different controls that they had, they came up and agreed upon a story of a fictional boy who had died. I believe they deliberately built some inconsistencies into his story, some anachronisms, things like that into his story. But they had this entire backstory for him, and they had the story that he was part of, I believe, this particular house. And anyway, they came together and they began sort of meditating on this, and then they actually literally tried to reach out to this boy's spirit, even though he never existed, Philip. And they started getting all sorts of activity. I know that there was definitely some table tipping stuff and some mediumistic stuff, and I believe some Ouija board stuff that all seemed to confirm this particular story. And I think there were some things that were more dramatic that almost seemed to suggest that there was an objective third-party intelligence. Wow, now I'm realizing how much I don't know about it. But I think the fact that exists, and again, I'm sure, apologies if I'm not getting this right. It's been a while since I've read the story. But this is a pretty well documented case of basically psychical researchers literally fashioning out of whole cloth an entity. And it says a lot about the role that we play in this, but it also says, I think, some sort of role about of what we do in terms of how these phenomena might sort of jump onto things that we believe.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the hardcore psi researcher will say, well, it was, all a projection of these individuals, but someone who is interested in spirit phenomena might say, well, what if there was something listening in on all this and decided to wear that as a skin, decided to adopt that as an identity?
Yeah. I mean, I'm reminded immediately of, the people who have admitted to making crop circles. There's
right.
We go out and we make crop circles, but while we're out there, weird stuff happens all around us.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely. So that's why people were floating the idea of a hoax, but we were all like, we have reputations to keep up. Let's not do that.
Yeah.
So our focus shifted a little bit. So I think in that sense, what if hoaxes are actually part of what feeds these things? Mm-hmm. And what if that's why you see it cropping up all the time? And of course, you try to have these conversations with a staunch materialist. This idea that hoaxes are part of the phenomena, and they'll just roll their eyes.
Right.
But there is a very strong that's sort of explicative of why the hoaxes exist to begin with, right there, and the fact that they're rolling their eyes. These things exist to self-negate. They exist to cast aspersions upon themselves. Mm-hmm. And I mean, to me, it's not really a surprise that left-brain oriented folks can't grasp that. Because, it's such a beautiful literary sort of idea. It doesn't surprise me that they're not wired to think that way. But you spend enough time really looking into this and suspending your disbelief, and you start to see that, that's kind of what's happening.
Yeah.
It's baked right in there.
I mean, for me, it's even boils down to this almost very simplistic idea where some people are just hell-bent on being accepted by, mainstream science or approving this in some way to mainstream science, and I don't think it's ever going to happen. I really don't. And these are the kind of people that you can't even talk about the hoax thing with. It's like, nope, those immediately it disqualifies everything because if they include hoaxes in it, then that soils their reputation as a scientist or as someone who is trying to appeal to science with a capital S.
It's one of those things where, I hate to quote the guy so often, but he's, love him or hate him, he's one of the smartest people I've ever listened to. And that's Gordon White, and he talks about how we as anomalists, he was specifically speaking about magicians, but we as anomalists have as much, in fact, more of a right to look to the materialists and say, you're playing in our pool. Why do we have to answer to you when, the vast momentum of human experience, and indeed a majority of the 7 billion people who live on this planet, feel that these things are real and see them manifest on a regular basis in their lives? Why do we have to try to fit our worldview into your particular narrow framework? Why do we have to cede that authority? Why can't we demand the opposite?
Well, it's my new favorite phrase is turning their claim on the head that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Why aren't you looking for extraordinary evidence? You're only looking for very, very ordinary evidence. The lowest hanging fruit. Yeah. Similarly, again, people are going to just roll their eyes rather, not their minds. They might roll their minds. We would hope they could roll their minds.
Any significantly advanced magic will look like technology.
Yeah. Extraordinary evidence is going to require. I love footprints. If we're talking Sasquatch, I think they're so cool. Like, I'll cast footprints all day long. I love hair samples. I think it's amazing. I'd love to get some hair samples. These things are incredible. I love them. I think they're valuable. But it's very ordinary evidence, and it's not gotten us anywhere in 50 plus years.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying there's no value to it. I think there's incredible value to it. I don't think the value is necessarily going to be DNA tests or dermal ridges. It's great they're there, but as many experts as you can get to fall in line on one side, you can probably find more to fall in line on the other and claim it's nothing. The extraordinary evidence is going to be the weird stuff, and it's just mainstream science isn't ready for it. They're not ready for it. They may never be ready for it, and I don't know what to say about it.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you, and I think that well, let's be honest here. Some people get up in arms about this, but we're on the winning side. Like things are going in the weird direction. I think this is super apparent. If you look at the magical renaissance, if you look at the emergence of people who are into astrology and neo-paganism, I'm a Christian myself. That's my worldview. But I think that we're definitely on the swing to people accepting these things, and I think that, again, science and these topics are not mutually exclusive. It's all in the way that we're approaching the science. Science is a tool. Materialism is an ethos, and the materialist model is on its knees. I'm not going to talk about quantum ideas, because if you think was it you told me, if you think you know anything about quantum physics, you don't. So that's the big quote. But
was that me?
But
did I say that?
It might have been you, or I think it was you.
Was it? If I did, that's brilliant.
or it was either you or you were quoting somebody else.
Yeah, I may have been quoting someone else.
But not only that, I think that anybody who can read Dean Radin's work, anybody who can read Rupert Sheldrake's work with a straight face, and then go back to this idea of reductive materialism needs to really wake up. So we're on the not to draw battle lines and sort of up the rhetoric, but we are on the winning side. It's going to happen, and it's just a matter of that particular paradigm shifting over, and it's already happening. I have often wondered if what we're not really looking at with all cultures is this continuous cycle of paganism leads to religion, which really leads to atheism, which leads to paganism, which leads to religion, which leads to atheism. each is a reaction to the other, and we're just seeing that cycle unfolding over and over and over again.
Well, but on the most basic level, and this has come up so much recently. I was, just to give an example, I was at a paranormal con, 3 weeks ago, something like this. And there was some police officers there who were ghost hunters. And I was talking with them, and they said, yeah, we get a bunch of guff from the other officers when they're in a group. And they said, but when they're alone, he said, without fault, they'll start telling us stories. And I said, you know what? It's the same thing. Like, I will have people who's like, yeah, I don't have anything weird. Nothing weird's ever happened to me. And then but there was that one time.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like everybody has something, and it's a matter of drawing it out of them. And sometimes that something's very minimal, but it's it seems like everybody's got something. People all the time, no, I don't. There's nothing. Well, there's that one thing,
No, I totally agree with that. I've often thought that a good idea might be for a book might be collecting those stories of people who said no, nothing, but everybody's just literally just set up shop in a coffee house for a month and just collect those stories, and just to give people an idea of how in depth these things are. I would argue that we have strange things happen to us multiple times on a daily basis, and we find ways to rationalize them and write them off. Like that thing that you see out of the corner of your eye, I'm like, I guess it was nothing. You don't even think about. Maybe that was something. Maybe that was something. I know even since I've been involved in this, the number of eye rolls that I get and the number of Snickers that I get, not the candy, it has decreased substantially. There are people that I talk to, and they actually open up about, that's really cool. I totally think that there's something to this. I tend to not bring up that aspect of my life, even around musicians who are usually a little bit more open-minded people. I just tend to not bring it up because inevitably what they think I think is not what I think. But I've been amazed at the number of people who are really open to these ideas. And actually, one of the things that really hit me and sold me with this is that, looking back when I first started, I was in a band, and one of the guys was like, "So do you really believe in UFOs?" And I'll never forget it. Our lead singer, she takes a drag of a cigarette and she goes, "Well, what it's really about is consciousness." And I'm like, well, this is where the discussion is nowadays.
Wow.
And I think it really is. I think it really is.
Yeah, I mean, even the fellow on last podcast on the left, whenever he talks about it, the fellow Henry, who, by the way, has had a flannel man experience, referenced Strange Familiar, and has not come on my show to tell his flannel man experience yet. So, Mr. Zabrowski, if you're listening, come on, Strange Familiars, let's talk flannel man. Anyway, he repeatedly refers to it as a psychedelic experience. And I think that's brilliant because, and he made a reference the other day to it being a psychedelic experience for the aliens as well. Like, we're entering into this like sort of shared psychedelic experience, which is, I mean, that's an incredible way to look at it, and maybe very valid.
I mean, yeah, well, that was one of, the things that Terence McKenna. Well, first of all, let's back this up and say that you're sort of a Terence McKenna guy, right?
Yes, I mean, I'm not super well informed on him, but the speeches I've heard, the things I know about him, yes,
Okay. So yeah, let's take a step back, and I will say that if you are into any of these subjects and you aren't at least passingly familiar with some of the concepts behind Terence McKenna, I judge you so hard.
Yeah, I mean, at least listen to some of the speeches. I mean, they're out there. They're easy to find, and if you're looking for something to listen to or something to get into, check him out because he's an incredible thinker. Did psychedelics lead to the assaults, or did he just have an incredible mind that combined with psychedelics? I guess that's the big question.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and honestly, like, I have not done any psychedelics. Some people would criticize that about my work. But having said that, you don't even have to be really into psychedelic culture to appreciate some of the thinking that he talks about. And one of his ideas was, what if reality itself is psychedelic? I mean, so the psychedelic state is something that is, in some sense, difficult to navigate. It's all very strange, all very alien. It feels fleeting. It's difficult to remember. But that's kind of the way that we are when we're children. So what if you were able to spend months or years in that psychedelic space? Would it feel as natural as reality does? And in that sense, flipping that on its head, what if our reality as we know it is just our sort of default psychedelic mode, which is an idea that I really like. And I think that, again, another one of those things, I feel like the psychedelic experience, or rather the altered state, altered consciousness experience, is 100% at least a part of the quote-unquote extraterrestrial contact experience / fairy experience. 100%. If you look at sort of the buzzing that precedes these events, you can find analogs for that in a lot of psychedelic literature. If you look at some of the imagery, it's there. If you look at some of the entities that are encountered in psychedelic states, it's all there. It really is all there. Which, why am I too chicken shit to do it? I don't know. It's something I'll embrace. But yeah, there's something to it. It's a piece of the puzzle that the ufologists and, of course, the cryptozoologists are going to be the last ones to look at it anyway because they're so thirsty for that scientific cred. But the ufologists, in the same sense, are just now coming around to as well.
One of the most intense UFO experiences I ever had was on psychedelics. And, was it real? I don't, are they ever real? And it's like when I talk about abduction, I was so happy when I heard... when I was talking with Mike Cleland on Where Did the Road Go, and I said, look, I don't ever think I left my bed. And he said, well, that's exactly the way I describe it for myself. And I was so happy to hear someone else say that. Like, my body was in my bed. Like, I'm pretty sure. You know what I mean? My mind wasn't. I was somewhere else. But my body was in my bed. And to hear people finally say, no, this counts. I was very hesitant to talk about psychedelic experiences in regards to this stuff because I thought, well, it doesn't count. You know what I mean? I was tripping, so it doesn't count. And to hear people start saying, no, it counts. This is we're talking about the same kind of things is it's very encouraging, and we have to start leaving this mind space, where it either is or it isn't. It either, it's either a completely real ape walking around or it's not. Well, no, it can't, at the time people see it, I absolutely believe it's real. I believe they could reach out and touch it. It can reach out and touch them. Does that mean it's real in the same way that a squirrel is, that's out there? I don't think so. I think it's more woven into this experience of the other, which is just really, really weird.
Well, and I mean, so I think this is something that is going to need to be said in the forward of the new book, but it is something that I thought of pulling out of a gas station, so I recorded it on audio. But it's intellectually dishonest to toss out strange Bigfoot reports. I firmly stand behind that. At the same time, it's intellectually dishonest to ignore the fact that a lot of the cases that you see describe beings that behave and have even just physiological attributes that are resonant with behavior currently studied by primatologists. I mean, I'm talking about, the fact that you have that very common ape pursed lips hooting that you see.
Right.
That's a trait in a lot of old world apes. Pillow erection, so the idea that their hair stands up when they're agitated. That's something else as well. Mm-hmm. Mid-tarsal breaks, dermal ridges on the footprints. These are things that are 100% indicative of a primate. And that's something
rocking while agitated.
Yeah. All these things. These are all things that in some instances brachiating, in some instances the way that they carry children. I mean, all these things are very much things that we would expect from primates. So we have to find some sort of, we have to find that narrow way in between. Something, and this is, I'm sure we'll address this. I'm not going to be coy about it because I've said it at numerous junctures in the past. I'm really actually kind of bullish on the idea that we're not looking at something that's reminiscent of Mike Clelland's owls. So the idea that, if you've read Mike's work, he does not make any bones about the fact that there are mundane flesh and blood owls out there. I mean, you can't unless you're living in complete denial. That's a thing. There are animals called owls, birds called owls. Birds are animals anyway. There's always that person like, you mean animals or mammals? No, mammals and anyway. But there are also times when the owls are strange. And there are also times when the owls exhibit attributes that are not like natural owls, and they are attached to something greater. And sometimes I wonder if that's not the case. Sometimes I wonder if there's not a relict population of actual flesh and blood hominids, and that sort of pageantry is adopted by this other sometimes. Because, I mean, if you want to get someone's attention, it's probably a better skin to wear than a deer or an owl. Yeah.
But then you have the owl thing. Around Site 7 constantly. You know what I mean? And they're perfectly normal screech owls. We're recording there. But they're there constantly. Does that mean something? I don't know, but it's certainly interesting.
Yeah. Maybe.
Right, yeah.
I mean... Yeah. I honestly, I don't think I've ever seen an owl in the wild. I've heard them from time to time, but...
See, I was the same way until I read Mike's book.
Yeah,
it's completely bizarre, and I mean, well, you've read my book where I talk about, I even felt like I had kind of a lack of owls, and I was really sad about it. I thought they should be I grew up on a farm. I thought we should have owls. Might have seen one or two, cross in front of cars at night or something, maybe, but for the most part, didn't ever see one in the wild. Then I read Mike's book. And a whole bunch of, without giving too much away from my book, a whole bunch of owl synchronicities start happening. And then I start seeing them. I saw one with Allison one day when we were hiking. I saw one by myself one day when I was hiking. A barred owl took up residence outside my window. I actually recorded it for patrons. If you go back far enough on the patrons, you can hear. I just stuck the mic out the window one night and recorded this barred owl as I was sitting here editing the podcast. And that all happened after Mike's book, which is just... You wonder, is it the kind of thing like Psychic TV in the old number 23, where 23 was this magic number, and once they point it out, you start seeing 23 everywhere. But was it simply the fact that they pointed it out?
Yeah, and that's part of the problem, is that it's really easy to say as soon as you buy a RAV4, you're going to see a bunch of RAV4s on the road, and I totally get that line of thinking. But sometimes the activity is so ramped up.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I wonder if, but again, it's that sort of baked in idea of, there's no way to tell for sure.
Right.
It's that, baked in.
Yeah, but I
idea.
mean, to me, the owl stuff I was experiencing was of such personal significance that it was unignorable. You know what I mean?
Oh no, 100%. And that's where I tend to fall anyway. Having said that, I think sometimes I think I'm other deaf. I'm paranormal deaf.
Well, we'll try to remedy that when you come up this way. We'll try to get you to.
Yeah, but you say that. I don't want you to remedy it too hard.
Yeah, you don't want to like that. Oh man, sometimes it's just anyway. I've been over the raccoon attack. I pray that was a completely mundane thing.
That's actually a perfect example because you would not believe the number of road-killed raccoons I've seen.
Oh yeah,
since you told me that.
Yeah, ever since then, I see them everywhere. I see them absolutely everywhere since that happened. But hey, I don't know. And then people started coming to me with these stories just completely randomly of like, hey, have you ever thought about animals? Supernatural things in the form of natural animals, and they start coming and right afterwards, people who hadn't heard the raccoon story, where I'm just like, oh wow, where I'm getting these stories of fairy groundhogs and spiritual cats and this and that, things that appear to be absolutely natural, normal animals just start popping up around. I'm like, whoa, that's kind of weird, but who knows? That again, that's part of the thing. I'm going to try to bring it back around Changelings here.
Yeah. Where did the road go?
I think we talked when we talked Changelings, it was part of the Iron series. So we talked a lot about preventions for changelings. If you felt your child, and I don't think we did talk about this. So if people felt their child was a changeling, what did they do at that point?
Well, some would skip straight to. So you could look at it this way. There are means of confirming a changeling, and there are means of retrieving your child and replacing the changeling with your own child. Some people would skip straight to those retrieval methods. They would press some iron to the child's forehead, or they would automatically decide to place the child in an iron skillet above the fire. I mean, I said the book took you to dark places, folks.
Yeah.
More commonly, you see at least an attempt to confirm the fact that you have a changeling, and this would usually be some means of getting the changeling to speak, to reveal the fact that it was not an actual human child, but in fact an elderly fairy child, or an elderly fairy man, rather. Which is the most common changeling that you see in these stories. Sometimes you would make a passing reference to the fact that the nearby fairy fort was on fire, and then the fairy would be so startled, the changeling would be so startled that it would either exclaim that it's had to go fetch its tools, and then it would be outed, or sometimes the fact that the fairy hill was on fire would cause the changeling to get up and flee to go put out the fire, and then you'd turn around and your own human child would be there. Again, that idea that you never actually see the re-exchange of the human child implies that we're dealing with something that's metaphysical than actually a literal physical abduction.
Right.
The most common method that you see, and there are a bunch of variations on this, are doing something nonsensical.
Yeah, and these recipes, in a way, remind me a lot of, like, folk magic recipes. Like, they tell you to do these very specific things, which remind me of some of these recipes out of, like, The Long Lost Friend and stuff.
Right, these very specific things that shouldn't have any significance, right? Mm-hmm. If it's almost like Well, I think I remember. Maybe is this something that all kids do, or is this just me being weird? Now that this memory just popped into my head, but I remember being a kid and thinking about making potions and like just taking things from around the yard and putting them into a pot and like acting like it was a potion. Is that something
no,
that
I
kids
did that.
do?
I totally did that.
Okay, cool. But it almost has that sort of feel to it, right? So in this specific case, like so the idea of creating this absurd space for this changeling, again, the idea was that you do something so absurd that the elderly changeling man would say, because it was almost always a male child that was substituted in these stories, the elderly fairy man would say, I've lived X number of years, but I've never seen this particular absurdity.
Yeah, is it like boiling? Is it boiling water in an eggshell? Was that one?
Yeah, the brewery of eggshells motif, and that encompasses an entire spectrum of different behaviors that you could do. Oftentimes, you'd visit a fairy seer, a fairy man, a fairy woman, or whatever your indigenous sort of cunning man or cunning woman were, and they would typically prescribe again, this is just one of like probably 40 different methods that I detail in the book, but one of the most common ones was this brewery of eggshells method, and they would say that you should need to crack a bunch of eggshells and put water or porridge in them, and then set these cracked open eggshells by the fireplace. And eventually the changeling would be so interested in this bizarre behavior that they would actually speak up and say, what are you doing? And you tell them, well, I'm brewing porridge. Or, again, the liquid in the vessel varies. Sometimes it was empty walnut shells. Sometimes in coastal communities it was shellfish husks or clams or mollusks. Sometimes what was inside was beer. Sometimes it was porridge. Sometimes it was oil. A lot of different variations.
Right.
But eventually the changeling would say, what are you doing? And you'd say, I'm doing whatever. So I'm making porridge, or I'm brewing beer. And they'd say something to the extent of, well, 900 years have I lived, and I have seen the acorn before the oak was a common one that you used to hear. So this implication that I've lived a very long time, and never have I seen people making porridge in eggshells. And at this juncture, the parent would usually either threaten the changeling with something which would make them flee, or do one of several methods, which would be abandoning them in some sort of liminal space, shoving them out on the dung heap, again, baking them, pressing hot tongs to their toes, splashing them in the face with urine, beating them senseless. There are 1,000 different methods by which the child could be restored. And, if you look at, again, sort of tying into that idea about this having some sort of metaphysical basis, sometimes I wonder, all the methods for actually restoring your child, well, I say all, a majority, involve some sort of abuse. There are some where you'd actually pass a wreath over a child or something to that extent, where you'd actually you'd actually act like you're going to burn the child, or you would, pray over the child. Anyway, most of them involved abuse. And I wonder if we are dealing with something metaphysical, that the very act of abusing the child might not shock the spirit out of it. Now, of course, that's something of a controversial opinion to suggest, the act that, there could be something positive in an experience like that. Right. But again, invariably in these stories, people will place the changeling somewhere overnight, and they'll come back and the changeling will be restored. The actual re-exchange is never seen. Of course, the idea behind the abuse, from a folkloric perspective, was that the fair folk would actually see that one of their own was being mistreated, and they would actually re-exchange because they didn't want to see one of their own people mistreated. It's one of those things where you could literally write a book just on the proposed medical diagnoses, the medical explanations for changelings. You could write a book exclusively dedicated to, these children who were killed because they were believed to be changelings. That's a book in and of itself. And we're not even talking about adults that were killed. One of the famous ones was Bridget Cleary, who was a young lady who was convinced of whose husband, I believe, was convinced that she was a changeling, and ended up burning her as well.
Wow. So adults were sometimes exchanged.
Well, and here's again another dimension to this. It's a big ball of twine to untangle here. But another aspect of this is ideas of enforced power structures and patriarchy, which is a word that I tend to not throw around too often, but it's very apparent that's exactly what's going on here. You have the fact that the ones who are most vulnerable to changelings are women and children. So, the adult man is the one who's least susceptible to this phenomena. So it almost is, a means of keeping unruly children and women in check. You could sort of accuse them of those things. There's no shortage of stories where a marriage was dissolved because, she's actually a changeling now. But yeah, especially women in there are tons of women in changeling stories of women young ladies or women who died in childbirth that I didn't include. I touched upon it just a little bit, but there are quite a few of adult women who were exchanged with changelings as well. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about stalks, which is really, really interesting. Like, I guess maybe I'd heard of this before, but there's a lot of this idea of babies being replaced with logs.
It's a weird one, and it's one that doesn't get a lot of play because, honestly, it's the least common substitute for children. But it's this idea that there would be some sort of inanimate object. Typically, a stalk or a fetch would be a way to describe basically a log. But this could be anything from an effigy to, even a dead child. Sort of is behind this, ideas behind this. But the stalk is what we'll sort of focus on, which is the notion of like I said, a log that's been glamored to appear as a fairy or as a human child. And over time would sort of reveal itself to be stiff and immobile. A lot of people think this might be a way of explaining sudden infant death syndrome or perhaps, some sort of infantile paralysis. But there's some really interesting ideas behind this pretty innocuous idea of the stalk. If you look at what stalks are in horticulture, there are means of intertwining two separate plants into one singular plant. So there's this motif of hybridity sort of built into that particular idea, which I think is really interesting if you look at sort of the alien-human hybrid idea that, there are these hybrids. Well, they've got this sort of tangential relationship to the stalk. What I found really compelling, and of course, so maybe I should back up why I'm even talking about alien-human hybrids to begin with. So I've drawn comparisons ad nauseum to these alien-human hybrids in ufological circles, this idea that extraterrestrials will abduct an individual, combine their DNA with either exclusively extraterrestrial DNA or their DNA with another abductee and extraterrestrial DNA, and create and gestate a human-alien hybrid, which at some point will be presented to the mother, typically the mother, sometimes the father, in a sort of baby presentation. And there are multiple aspects of this which find antecedent in fairy lore, which we may or may not get into. I'm going to try to keep it sort of a little bit more focused. The descriptions of these hybrid children are a pretty close match for descriptions of changelings. Large heads, large eyes, spindly legs, a sense of being either too light or too heavy. Interestingly enough, they do not seem to be cranky or overly hungry like changelings did, but they do seem to have the listlessness that you find in some changeling reports, the idea that they're just sort of hanging out. Having said that, we've already addressed this idea of the stalks, which is, this idea that the changeling itself was actually a bit of like a log. I was extremely surprised to discover that there is a school of thought among ufologists, not necessarily ufologists that I put a lot of stock into, pardon the pun, but there is a school of thought that claims that anyone handling one of these human-alien hybrids will have their points of contact fluoresce violet-ish pink under black light. I'm not sure if I believe that or not, but I find it really interesting that chlorophyll is one of the substances that will fluoresce purpley pink under black light. So you have this, to draw a direct comparison, stalks were basically logs, and you have people who handle these human-alien hybrids showing up with what looks like chlorophyll on their hands. I think that there's something interesting in there. I don't know quite what to make of it. The ufologist will say that means that aliens are plant-based. Folklorists will say that means it's just a repetition of a motif. I don't really know where to draw that line, but I think it's interesting that you have that sort of plant connection even up through the modern day with these human-alien hybrids. As far as the reality of these stalks, I cited someone there's this phenomena of fairy artifacts all throughout the British Isles. Fairy shoes, fairy chalices, fairy jerkins, fairy hats. Like these are supposedly relics that have been recovered. Some of them are quite compelling. There's actually, I believe, a fairy shoe that was recovered that was just maybe an inch or so long that was made out of mouse leather. I don't know how
is that the one Patrick Harper talks about?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. I don't know who goes to the effort, and I don't know how you tan mouse leather. Like I don't, and I don't know how you fashion a tiny shoe out of it. Anyway, having said that, fairy flags are another one. There has been no real recovered fairy stock, which is really interesting. I'm not sure, if that implies that it's strictly metaphorical or if there's.
However, in your book, there is a recovered sort of Bigfoot stock. I'd never heard that story before. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I don't know what to make out of this. I mean, but at the same time, the motifs are there. So, bringing this around to Bigfoot, and I'm sure I will be touching on this in our new book. But you see echoes of this stock idea. It's very common amongst Bigfooters to suggest that Bigfoot are so adept at stopping and standing still that somehow they end up looking like tree stumps or logs, which I don't know if I could ever mistake fur for bark, but maybe at a certain distance that's possible. So not only have it sort of explained in that way, but there is a story out of I believe it was somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. I think it was Idaho, where. Well, I guess Idaho is kind of the Northwest. It was Washington. Sorry. Who claimed to have watched a Bigfoot walk briefly into the woods and then lay down and turn into a log. And supposedly, she dragged it into her house where she used it as a coffee table.
Right? That is amazing.
Which is like, I love that.
I know. I love that story so much. Like,
I have no idea if it has any truth to it, but I love it. Now, interesting is that I sort of drew a parallel to this. So stalks were also commonly employed to abduct mothers with their children. And there's a famous changeling variant story of this father who hears sawing and hammering coming from his barn. And he's curious because he's the only one there that day. Or he's not, but he's only help there that day. His wife and child are in the other room. And he goes into the barn and he sees nothing. It looks like people have just dropped their tools, but there is this giant wooden effigy of his wife. And he thinks it's really odd, but he takes a look at the finger, and one of the fingers is sort of offset, like a bone that's been broken and not healed correctly. And he recalled when he was hearing this hammering and sawing and pounding that a voice say, "Mind the crooked finger." And the idea behind this was that the fairies were actually constructing this effigy to take the mother and the child away. Basically, this was a version of a stock changeling for a woman. So in order to foil the fairies, the father tosses a Bible into the barn and says some holy words, and then he's left with this giant wooden effigy of his wife, this stock of his wife. And in that story, he supposedly takes that stock into his house and uses it as a cutting board. So again, I see some similarities between that story and the coffee table Bigfoot story.
Yeah.
But yeah, coffee table Bigfoot. I want a Bigfoot coffee table.
I know, right? That's amazing. That's like, first of all, that takes some guts too. Like I'm gonna drag it inside my house and then just use it as a coffee table.
Yeah, and in case anybody wonders the source, that was Barton Nunnally's 2017 update of his book, The Inhumanoids, which I have not seen anything to make me ever doubt Barton's credibility. He was part of the family that was involved with the Spottsville Monster.
Yeah, incredible story. He also one of the first people I saw to collect the Flannel Man in the Mine story.
Oh, okay.
Which I don't believe he, specifically calls Flannel Man, but I mean, by description, guy in flannel, in a mine comes out and tells the miners, "Hey, you're going to be rescued," and then walks back through a door in the side of the mine that no one can ever find again.
Now, is that your only Flannel Man in a mine story?
So far, I believe, yeah.
Because there's no shortage of stories with that motif of something coming through a door that you can't see, and then I'm reminded of the Tommyknockers.
Yes, which we have in Pennsylvania, by the way. You talk about these creatures following import populations.
Right.
Where we have Welsh miners, we have Tommyknockers.
Right, which is, how much more interesting would Stephen King's book have been if it was about actual Tommyknockers?
Yeah. I mean, missed opportunity, Mr. King. Which I know he listens. So,
but this is where I say, and of course there are better fits that everyone will get to read about in hopefully 2020. Yeah, knockers, Tommyknockers.
Yes,
the knocks are something that the more you get into it, the more you talk to magicians and stuff. That seems to very much a spirit phenomena sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Coming into it first from Bigfoot and then expanding my perspective to these other things. Like, slaps on the wall, that's Bigfoot. Well, no. I mean, yes, but also. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, the thing that and again, part of what this is so frustrating is that you look at, there's a bulk of phenomena that sit at the center of fairies and poltergeist and spirits and witches. Tossing of rocks, knocks. I mean, all these things are there, and they're also there, with the Bigfoot thing. Mm-hmm. It becomes a little bit more difficult. That's a conversation to be had about sightings of Bigfoot actually throwing things. There's plenty of those. They're not super common, but there are plenty of them. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's just I'm sorry. I don't mean to keep on bringing it back to weird Bigfoot, but that's the headspace that I'm in right now.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I tell you what, we are going to give away 2 copies of Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. This book is available if you don't happen to be one of the lovely people that is a patron and wins a copy. You can get it from Anomalous Books. It's on Amazon. It's available at your bookstore. You can order it from there. It's Joshua Cutchin, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions. Josh, we're going to have you pick 2 random numbers, unless you have a 173-sided die. Do you have one of those?
Oh, man. No.
Okay. Well, then we're going to do 2 numbers between 1 and 173.
Oh, geez. Okay. Let's do 138.
Okay.
That's a lot. I take it these are Patreon numbers, right?
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. I was like, usually it's 1 in 10. I'm like, geez.
Okay, so the first winner is Rachel Sandwick. Rachel Sandwick, you have won a copy of Thieves in the Night. I will be in touch to get your address.
A signed copy, might we add?
A signed copy, absolutely. And I will ask you for number 2, or your second number.
All right, 22.
These have been randomized, but there's a big long list, so I have to go through the list here, and we'll get to number 22. Brian Waters, you are a winner of a copy of Thieves in the Night. Congratulations.
Nice. Congrats, Brian.
Brian Waters and Rachel Sandwick. I will be in touch, and I will mail you your copies of Thieves in the Night. Josh, thank you for coming on. Where can people find Josh Cutchin?
At joshuacutchin.com. You can listen to all my interviews if you're a real glutton for punishment. And I'm trying to be a little bit better about blogging on there. I've been being a little bit more prolific with that. So that's that. I am on Where Did the Road Go? Also on a semi-regular basis. Probably my life's getting a little bit crazy, so maybe a little bit less recent coming up. But you can find all 3 of my books, A Trojan Feast, The Brimstone Deceit, and Thieves in the Night at Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com, or ask your library or ask your brick and mortar store. All those are good options.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. Have a good one.
You're welcome, Tim. Appreciate it.
Strange Familiars is a production of Dark Holler Arts, music, books, art, podcasts, and more. darkhollerarts.com. If you're on Facebook, look us up. We're facebook.com/strangefamiliars. We also have the Strange Familiars Gathering group there, so you can check that out. Join and share news stories and interact with other people and so forth. Intro and background music is by Stone Breath. Go to stonebreath.bandcamp.com for more.
howling wind, to the rushing rain, to the flowing stream that carries the stars within each tiny grain. Held to the impure blood from the twisted roots, through the purest hearts that tasted the juice of Babel's forgotten fruit. Held to the snowy peaks, to the hammered stone, to the single eye that sees the dead soul and living go to war. Held to the desert sun, to the swirling sand, to the lonely men who write divine words, all with a mortal hand. Held to the calling crows with their songs of life, made from words of death, and hail to the ghosts who dance for days on end. Alice is a long time gone, my friend. Alice is a long time gone. Oz is very far away, my friend. Alice is a long time gone. We shall have no home under the sun. Alice is a long time gone. Till we braid our hair as one, my friend. Alice is a long time gone. Drink under the moon with me, my friend. Alice is a long time gone. Listen to the owl so far away. Alice is a long time gone. Alice is a long time gone.